4.6 million vehicles. That is how many cars BYD sold in 2024, making it the undisputed king of the global electric vehicle market. And here is the number that should terrify every legacy automaker in Detroit and Wolfsburg. BYD's total revenue hit $107 billion last year, officially surpassing Tesla for the first time in history. I'm Alex.
And I'm Maya. Welcome back to Asia Tech Macro. Okay, Alex, I have to say, I have been watching BYD's rise for years now, but even I was shocked by the pace of what is happening in 2026. This is no longer just a China story. BYD is going global at a speed that no one predicted.
Let me walk through the numbers because they are genuinely staggering. In the first quarter of 2025, BYD delivered over 1 million electric vehicles. Tesla delivered 336,000 in the same period. That is a 3-to-1 ratio. BYD's net income hit 9.15 billion yuan, about $1.3 billion, while Tesla reported just 409 million. BYD is now beating Tesla on revenue, on deliveries, and on profit, the trifecta.
And what is even more impressive is BYD's domestic dominance. They hold 32% of China's entire new energy vehicle market. Tesla has just 6% in China. That is a 5-to-1 market share gap in what is now the world's largest auto market.
But here's where the story gets really interesting and really geopolitical. BYD is not content with dominating China. They are targeting 1.3 million overseas shipments in 2026, up 24% from 2025. And the biggest battleground is Europe.
Europe is where this turns into a trade war story, right? Because the EU hit Chinese EVs with tariffs.
Exactly. In October 2024, the European Commission imposed countervailing duties ranging from 7.8% to 35.3% on Chinese EV imports. BYD specifically got an additional 17% tariff on top of the standard 10% car import duty. That is a 27% total tariff. The EU said Chinese automakers were receiving unfair government subsidies that gave them an artificial price advantage.
And yet, even with those tariffs, BYD sales in the European Union surged 272% year over year. They registered about 160,000 units in the EU in 2025. How is that even possible with a 27% tariff?
Because BYD's cost advantage is so enormous that even with tariffs, their cars are still significantly cheaper than European equivalents. The BYD Seal, which competes with the Tesla Model 3 and the BMW i4, starts at around 25,000 euros in China. Even with a 27% tariff, that's still about 32,000 euros, which undercuts the BMW i4 by over 10,000 euros. The cost structure advantage is structural, not marginal.
That is insane. So the tariffs are essentially failing to protect European automakers.
That's exactly the conclusion Brussels reached. And that is why in January 2026, the EU made a dramatic policy pivot. They released a new guidance document proposing a price undertaking framework. Instead of tariffs at the border, Chinese manufacturers like BYD, Geely, and SAIC can agree to sell their vehicles at or above a certain price floor. It's essentially a negotiated minimum price.
Wait, so the EU went from aggressive tariffs to saying, okay, just promise to charge at least this much? That sounds like a surrender.
Some analysts are calling it exactly that. The Torque News headline called it the Great EV Truce of 2026. But there is strategic logic here. The tariffs were creating collateral damage. European consumers were paying more for EVs, which was slowing the continent's own green transition goals. And China was retaliating aggressively. Beijing launched anti-dumping probes into EU pork products, anti-subsidy investigations into European dairy, and further anti-dumping investigations into French brandy and cognac. The French cognac industry was absolutely furious. Rémy Martin and Hennessy were looking at potential duties that could devastate their biggest export market. So Brussels found itself in an impossible position: protect the car industry and lose the agriculture lobby, or find a middle ground. The price floor was the political compromise.
And from what I am reading, even with tariffs still technically in place, Chinese EV exports to the EU are forecast to grow at about 20% annually between 2026 and 2028. So the tariffs slowed nothing. If anything, they just accelerated Chinese companies' plans to build inside Europe.
That is the deeper strategic insight here. Every tariff wall becomes an invitation to localize, and localization is permanent. Once BYD has a factory in Hungary employing thousands of European workers, it's not going anywhere. That factory becomes a political asset, not just a manufacturing asset. Local politicians will fight to keep it running. That is the long game China is playing.
Okay, so let me push back on the truce narrative. Because what I see is that Chinese EV makers are not just accepting the price floor and moving on. They are building factories inside Europe to bypass tariffs entirely. That is a much more aggressive long-term strategy.
You are absolutely right. And this is the part that should worry European automakers the most. BYD is building a massive factory in Hungary with an annual capacity of 800,000 units. That is not a pilot plant. That is a full-scale manufacturing operation, larger than most European car plants. Once that factory is running, BYD can produce cars inside the EU with zero tariff exposure, at Chinese-level manufacturing costs, using European labor that is still cheaper than German or French labor.
And it is not just BYD. Chery is building a plant in Spain. CATL, the world's largest battery maker, is building a battery gigafactory in Hungary as well. There is this whole Chinese automotive ecosystem being transplanted into Central Europe.
This is the China playbook that we saw with Japanese automakers in the 1980s. When the US and Europe imposed trade barriers on Japanese cars, Toyota and Honda responded by building factories in Ohio and the UK. Within a decade, they were not importers anymore. They were local manufacturers with political allies, local employees, and deep supply chain roots. BYD is running the exact same playbook, but faster.
And the battery side of this is equally important. CATL controls 38.1% of the global EV battery market. BYD is second with about 17%. Together, Chinese battery makers account for roughly 70% of global EV battery production. That is an extraordinary concentration of a critical technology.
And CATL just made a huge announcement. They confirmed that 2026 will be the year of large-scale sodium-ion battery deployment. Their next-generation sodium-ion battery achieves an energy density of 175 watt-hours per kilogram and supports a driving range of over 500 kilometers. The key innovation here is that sodium-ion batteries do not require lithium or cobalt, two minerals where China already dominates the refining supply chain. Sodium is literally everywhere. It's table salt.
So CATL is essentially building a backup to its own lithium dominance. That is like an oil company developing solar just in case?
It is even more strategic than that. By developing sodium-ion alongside lithium-ion, what CATL calls its dual star strategy, they are making themselves resilient against any Western attempt to restrict mineral access. If the US or Australia tries to limit lithium exports to China, CATL can just shift production to sodium-ion. They are removing their own vulnerability.
Let me bring up the ripple effects here, because this is not just about BYD versus Volkswagen. The entire global auto industry supply chain is being restructured. What is happening to legacy automakers?
The data is brutal. Volkswagen announced in late 2025 that it would close 3 factories in Germany for the first time in the company's 87-year history. Stellantis, which owns Fiat, Peugeot, and Chrysler, reported a 47% drop in operating profit. Ford's EV division lost $4.7 billion in 2024. These are not small setbacks. These are existential-level financial pressures.
And the irony is that European and American automakers spent decades building their competitive advantage around internal combustion engine technology. The engine, the transmission, the drivetrain, these are incredibly complex mechanical systems with decades of accumulated know-how. But EVs eliminated all of that overnight. An electric motor has about 20 moving parts versus 2,000 in an internal combustion engine.
Exactly. The technology moat that protected legacy automakers for a century was suddenly drained, and Chinese companies, which had no legacy internal combustion advantage to protect, leapfrogged directly to electric. BYD started as a battery company, not a car company. They think battery first, vehicle second. That is a fundamentally different engineering philosophy.
And now BYD is vertically integrated to a degree that is almost unheard of in the auto industry. They make their own batteries, their own chips, their own electric motors, their own power electronics. They even make their own seats. The level of vertical integration gives them cost control that no Western automaker can match.
Let me put a number on that. BYD's R&D spending in the first 3 quarters of 2025 actually exceeded its net profit. They spent more on research than they earned. That is an extraordinary commitment to technology leadership. They have over 90,000 engineers working on everything from blade battery chemistry to autonomous driving software. No Western automaker comes close to that level of in-house R&D intensity.
And then you add the fact that China's entire EV ecosystem is decades ahead. Charging infrastructure, battery recycling, supplier networks, software platforms, it is all more advanced in China than anywhere else. A Chinese EV buyer today has access to a charging experience, a software update cadence, and a price-to-feature ratio that simply does not exist in the US or Europe.
That is the ecosystem moat that people underestimate. It's not just BYD. It's BYD operating within an ecosystem of thousands of Chinese suppliers, software companies, and infrastructure providers that collectively make the Chinese EV market the most competitive and innovative in the world. Replicating that ecosystem outside of China is the real challenge of BYD's global expansion. All right, Maya, time for the contrarian corner. And I have to be honest, my contrarian take on Japan's semiconductor renaissance might surprise people because it cuts against the euphoria. Here it is. Japan's $65 billion semiconductor bet
might actually be too late and too small to matter in the global foundry race. But it might accidentally create something far more valuable in a completely different way.
Okay, that's intriguing. Walk me through that. Why too late and too small?
Let's do the math. Japan is spending $65 billion over roughly a decade. TSMC alone is spending $56 billion in capital expenditure in a single year, 2026. Samsung is spending over $40 billion. Intel is getting $52 billion from the U.S. CHIPS Act. Japan's total decade-long commitment is barely more than 1 year of TSMC's capex. In the brute force race for leading-edge volume production, Japan simply cannot outspend Taiwan, South Korea, or the United States. Rapidus plans to start at 6,000 wafers per month and scale to 25,000. TSMC's single Taiwan megafab produces over 100,000 wafers per month. The scale difference is enormous.
That's actually a really sobering comparison. So even if Rapidus succeeds technically, it would still be a tiny player in terms of volume.
In the commodity logic chip market, yes. But here's where my contrarian view gets interesting. I think the real value of Japan's semiconductor strategy isn't competing with TSMC on volume. It's creating a vertically integrated, geopolitically secure supply chain for specialized applications. Think about it. Japan already controls the materials and equipment. If it can add leading-edge fabrication, even at small scale, plus advanced packaging, which Rapidus is launching in April 2026, Japan becomes the only country in the world that can produce a complete advanced semiconductor from raw silicon to finished chip entirely within its own borders.
Wait, that's actually a huge deal. You're saying Japan could be the only fully sovereign semiconductor nation?
That's exactly what I'm saying. And in a world where semiconductor supply chains are increasingly weaponized, Taiwan faces cross-strait risk, South Korea is sandwiched between China and the US, and the US itself depends on ASML in the Netherlands and materials from Japan, being the one country that can do it all domestically is an extraordinary strategic asset. The value isn't in competing with TSMC for Apple's iPhone chips. It's in providing a secure end-to-end supply chain for defense, automotive autonomy, edge AI, and critical infrastructure.
That reframes the entire investment thesis. So instead of asking whether Rapidus can compete with TSMC, we should be asking whether Japan can build an integrated semiconductor ecosystem that's strategically irreplaceable.
Exactly. And there's evidence this is already the strategic thinking in Tokyo. The government isn't just funding fabs, it's funding the entire ecosystem. The Chitose hub for equipment testing, the Kyushu cluster around TSMC, Sony's image sensor expansion, Kyoshia's AI memory, Renaissance's power semiconductors. When you add it all up, Japan is building redundancy and self-sufficiency across every layer of the semiconductor stack.
But here's my pushback. Can Japan actually attract and retain the talent to make this work? The country has a severe demographic crisis. The working age population is shrinking, and semiconductor engineers are in global demand. TSMC famously struggled to recruit enough engineers for its Arizona fab. How is Japan going to staff 2 new cutting-edge fabs plus all the supporting infrastructure?
That's a legitimate concern. Rapidus has been actively recruiting from overseas, and they've brought in experienced engineers from Intel, Samsung, and GlobalFoundries. But you're right that the talent pipeline is a bottleneck. Japan produces about 45,000 engineering graduates per year, far fewer than India or China. The government has responded with visa reforms and special migration programs for semiconductor workers, but it remains to be seen whether that's enough. It's one of the top execution risks.
And there's another risk I want to flag. JASM, the TSMC joint venture in Kumamoto, actually reported operating losses. Building and running a cutting-edge fab is extraordinarily expensive. Even with billions in subsidies, profitability is not guaranteed. What happens if these fabs keep losing money after the subsidies run out?
That's the long-term sustainability question. And honestly, the answer depends on whether Japan can develop enough demand to keep these fabs utilized. A fab running at 50% utilization is a money pit. A fab running at 90% is a cash machine. The automotive industry, which is Japan's largest manufacturing sector, is transitioning to electric and autonomous vehicles that need vastly more semiconductors. If that transition accelerates, demand domestically could fill the capacity. If it stalls, you've got very expensive white elephants. All right, Maya, let's wrap up with 3 concrete action items for our listeners. Whether you're an investor, a tech executive, or just someone following the global chip race, Japan's semiconductor renaissance demands attention.
Action item number 1?
Number 1, position for the Japanese semiconductor equipment and materials supercycle. Forget about betting on whether Rapidus succeeds or fails as a fab. The guaranteed winners of Japan's chip renaissance are the equipment and materials companies. Tokyo Electron, which has near total dominance in EUV coders and developers, benefits regardless of whether the chips are made by TSMC, Rapidus, or anyone else. Shin-Etsu Chemical and Sumco supply over 50% of the world's silicon wafers. Screen Holdings, Lasertech, Disco Corporation, these are the picks and shovels plays. Every $1 billion spent on new fabs in Japan means hundreds of millions flowing to these companies. And here's the kicker. Many of them are still trading at reasonable valuations compared to their Western counterparts like ASML or Applied Materials.
That's a really practical way to play this theme without taking the binary risk of will Rapidus work or won't it. What about action item 2?
Number 2, watch the Rapidus advanced packaging launch in April 2026 as a leading indicator. Advanced packaging, which is how you connect multiple chip dies into a single package, is arguably more important than the node size itself. NVIDIA's AI chips use TSMC's advanced packaging. If Rapidus can demonstrate competitive advanced packaging capabilities, it opens up a completely different business model. Instead of competing with TSMC on leading-edge logic, Rapidus could become a specialized packaging house for AI and edge computing chips. The April 2026 pilot line launch is the next major milestone. If it hits technical targets, that's a strong buy signal for the entire Japan semiconductor thesis.
I love that framing. It's not about the 2-nanometer race. It's about the packaging capability. And action item number 3?
Number 3, reassess Japan in your portfolio through a semiconductor lens. Most global investors are underweight Japan. The Nikkei has been on a tear, up significantly from its 2023 lows, but much of that is driven by Warren Buffett's trading company bets and the weak yen story. The semiconductor renaissance adds a completely new structural growth driver. Japan's government target of 40 trillion yen in annual chip sales by 2040 implies a massive expansion of the country's industrial base. If even half of that materializes, it transforms Japan from a slow-growth, deflationary economy into a strategic technology hub. Consider increasing Japan allocation from the typical 2 to 3% in global portfolios to 5 to 8% with a tilt towards semiconductor-adjacent names.
And I'd add one more thought. The geopolitical premium on Japan's semiconductor strategy is underappreciated. In a world where the U.S. is restricting chip exports to China, where Taiwan faces invasion risk, and where Europe is still years behind on fab construction, Japan's ability to offer a politically stable, technologically advanced, fully integrated semiconductor supply chain is worth a premium that the market hasn't fully priced in.
That's exactly right. And here's the takeaway I want everyone to remember. Japan's semiconductor strategy is not about winning the foundry volume race against TSMC. That race was lost decades ago, and the gap is too wide to close. Japan's real play is becoming the world's only fully sovereign semiconductor nation, the one country that can produce every layer of an advanced chip, from materials to equipment to fabrication to packaging, without depending on any other nation. That's not just an industrial strategy. That's a national security asset. And in today's geopolitical environment, that might be the most valuable position of all.
That is a powerful reframe. From semiconductor loser to strategic indispensability. This story is just getting started.
No doubt. And coming up next, we'll be looking at the battle for AI inference at the edge, how Qualcomm, MediaTek, and Apple are fighting to put large language models on your phone, and what that means for cloud computing giants. You definitely want to tune in for that one.
And before we go, I want to highlight one more thing. Japan's chip strategy is also reshaping the country's regional economies. Kumamoto in Kyushu was a sleepy agricultural prefecture. Now land prices around the TSMC fab have doubled. New housing, restaurants, international schools are popping up. The same thing is starting to happen in Chitose, Hokkaido, around Rapidus. This isn't just a tech story. It's a story about how semiconductor investment can revitalize entire regions of a declining population country.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this different from the US CHIPS Act or the European CHIPS Act. In America and Europe, the fabs are being dropped into existing industrial areas. In Japan, they're becoming the anchor for entirely new economic ecosystems. That's transformative at a level that goes far beyond the chip industry itself.
Well, that's all the time we have today. Thanks everyone for listening.
Stay data-driven. Bye.